How do you run a Mario Kart 64 tournament? This is a question I had to ask myself before PA Kart Meet 2025, an in-person Mario Kart 64 convention in March of 2025. 35 people traveled from 15 states and 3 countries to just outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for 2 full days of kart racing and competition. The event was organized by Brody MK64, and I was the tournament director. That meant that I was responsible for making sure that all these people, some of whom had traveled thousands of miles and spent considerable money to be here, had a fun and fair tournament. It turned out to be a fairly complicated task involving hard time limits, unsolved math problems, fluctuating player counts, inspiration from a variety of sports, and general tournament theory. So sit back and learn about the mathematics of a Mario Kart 64 tournament. First, let's set the stage. This is going to be a versus tournament, which has 4 players sitting in front of the same TV and racing against each other for points. For many players, this is one of the only times they'll get to play versus because the N64 doesn't have online play. And even for those who do play online through other means, they rarely get to go to in-person events. So the pressure was on to get this all right. Now, when planning, we had to start with the most important constraint: time. You can plan the most perfect tournament in the world, and it will all be for naught if you don't finish in time. Every single decision we made about the tournament format had to account for time. So, how much time did we have for the tournament? Well, we had the venue for 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, from 9 a.m. till midnight. That sounds like it would be 15 hours a day, but we wouldn't be able to use all of that time for the tournament. First, we needed to do some setup each day. Also, it was likely that somebody would be late. So I didn't want to schedule anything before about 9:30 a.m. We also had similar constraints at the end of the day. We needed to be out of the venue by midnight, and people would need to gather up their belongings, organize rides, say goodbyes, etc. Any delays late in the evening could push us past our time limit, so it wasn't worth the risk to schedule anything that would go past 11 p.m. Additionally, we needed to factor in some times for people to eat. People could figure out their own breakfast options before getting to the venue, but this was an all-day event, so we needed people to be able to eat lunch and dinner. We factored in an hour a day for each of those. Finally, anybody who has planned a large event before knows that assuming everything will go right is just asking for trouble. We put in an extra hour of buffer time per day that I literally said was for, quote, random buffer and logistical issues. Altogether, this took out 4.5 hours per day, limiting us to 10.5 hours of usable playtime, or 21 hours total across the 2 days. So the question became, what can we get done in under 21 hours of playtime? To answer this, I was able to use recordings from the previous year to get a sense of how long matches typically took. In 2024, we had 2 types of matches. The first type were prelim mini matches. In these, a group of 4 players would play 4 tracks and accumulate points. I found these matches took, on average, about 12.5 minutes. There was also an additional 4 minutes of downtime whenever we needed to transition between groups. This was a total time of 16.5 minutes per group, but I rounded up to 20 minutes for safety. 20 minutes is also 1/3 of an hour, which I'll use later to simplify calculations. Since we now have an estimate of how long each match is, we need to multiply this by the number of prelim matches to get the total time. Now, the number of prelim matches is just however many groups we have per round, times however many rounds we have. And because everybody plays in a group of 4 each round, the number of groups per round is just the number of players divided by 4. Simplifying this, we get our answer. The amount of time in hours is the number of players times the number of rounds divided by 12. In the 2024 prelims, we had 5 rounds. If we did that again, we get the number of players times 5/12, again, in hours. After the prelims, we had the knockout rounds. In these, a group of 4 players would play all 16 tracks. Unsurprisingly, because these matches had 4 times as many tracks to play through, they took about 4 times as long. An average of 48 minutes, 15 seconds per match, and a longer setup time of 7.5 minutes. Again, it seemed prudent to round these times up slightly as a buffer, so this became 1 hour per knockout match. Now, for the knockout rounds, there are a lot of different potential formats you can use for knockout tournaments. Because it's March, all the college conferences in the US just had their conference tournaments, so we might as well use them as examples. To start, you've got the Mid-Eastern Athletic Conference. They have a standard 8-team bracket, which takes 7 games to crown a champion. The Big South has 9 teams, so they add an extra play-in game for a total of 8 games. Now we have the Missouri Valley Conference, which has 12 teams, so the top 4 teams get a bye to the quarterfinals. This results in an 11-game bracket. Next up is the Coastal Athletic Association, which does a mixture of play-in games and byes. Looks kind of strange, but it takes 13 games to determine a champion among its 14 teams. And finally, the Sun Belt does this. Apparently, it's called a stepladder tournament. It looks wild and definitely makes it very tough for the worst-seeded teams. Anyways, this also takes 13 games to crown a champion among 14 teams. With all of these different possible formats, you'd think you'd have to nail down all the details before you could figure out how many games would be in the tournament. But there's actually a very simple pattern. Notice that each tournament has one more team than it has games. This is for a very simple reason. Each game eliminates one team from the tournament. If you want to crown a champion, you'll have to eliminate teams until there is just one team remaining. These formats differ in how they decide which teams will play when, but the number of matches is simply determined by how many teams they need to eliminate. So for a basketball tournament, we have that the number of matches equals the number of teams minus 1. Mario Kart 64 is slightly different because there are 4 players in each match instead of 2 teams. For the 2024 knockouts, we had the top 2 players advance from each match, while the bottom 2 were eliminated. Eliminating 2 players per match instead of 1 means we could essentially halve the number of games. And because we were budgeting 1 hour per match, this also is the number of hours it should take. So, if we kept this format, the maximum number of players we could accommodate while staying under 21 hours was 24. During planning, we were a little uncertain exactly how many people would enter the tournament, but our estimates were always higher than 24, and even as high as 36 at one point. 36 people would have been 50% more than we could accommodate without changing anything. And it would have required a full 3rd day to actually finish. We simply did not have that much time. We had to change something from the previous year. The question was, what? Well, there were 3 main options. The first option was to limit the number of players who could enter. We really didn't want to do this because it would kind of defeat the entire point of the event. We took some pride that this was an open event with a low barrier to entry. We wanted everyone who was interested to be able to participate in the tournament. The second option was to reduce the number of matches. This was plausible. One option was to have only the first place player advance from each knockout match, eliminating 3 players instead of 2. This would probably work, but would have really reduced the number of people who had competitive matches. And the third option was to make matches faster. This also initially seemed implausible. There's not much downtime during a Mario Kart 64 match. Players are racing, so they are playing almost non-stop except for brief periods between races where they may pause momentarily to allow the stream to update info. However, technically, saying we had to make matches faster was incorrect. We just had to fit more matches into the same amount of time. So our actual solution was to play multiple matches at once. If we used multiple TVs, we could multiply the number of matches we could fit into the same amount of time. This would come with greater logistical complexity because we'd have to track multiple groups playing simultaneously, but it would provide the greatest time benefits by far. We ended up settling on using 3 setups during the group stage. This meant we could theoretically fit 3 times as many group matches into the same time period. After adjusting the math, we see that we can now accommodate about 34 players without issue, and multiple setups provided us with a lot of flexibility as well. If we ended up with more people or we ran into severe delays, we could also run multiple setups during the knockout stage to catch up on time. As mentioned before, we wanted everybody to play 5 rounds of prelim matches. In each round, we would break players into groups of 4. Importantly, we wanted to make sure that nobody would play the same opponent twice during this phase. This sounds like a fairly trivial constraint, just don't match people against the same opponent twice. However, when I started working on schedules, I found it to be surprisingly difficult to actually create a schedule for 5 rounds that obeyed this rule. Let's use an example to see why this is difficult. Let's say we have 32 players, and we'll just call them players 1 through 32. We'll use a grid to show the groups for each round. For this first round, we'll just place the players randomly, and each row will show which players are in the same group. So, for example, the first row here has players 25, 28, 3, and 11, so they will be in the same group for this round. Similarly, the next row shows that players 18, 29, 6, and 15 are in the same group, and so on for each row. We'll go ahead and use this as our round 1 schedule, but things are going to be a little bit more complicated for the second round. Let's start by choosing a random player to put in our schedule. In this case, it's player 10. Now, we don't want player 10 to face somebody that they already played in the first round. So, we can't add any of their first round opponents, that's players 9, 17, or 24, to their second round group. Let's highlight those players in red to show that they can't be added. We now choose one of the remaining possible players to join player 10 and randomly selected player 4. Of course, we now have to think about players 4's first round opponents as well, which further restricts who we can add to the group. Next, we randomly select player 29, and after adding those new restrictions, we finally finish the group with player 7. That wasn't so bad for creating the first group in the round, but let's skip ahead a bit. What happens when we get to the last group of the round? Now we have 4 leftover players to place. That's players 23, 25, 28, and 15. Unfortunately, players 25 and 28 played against each other in the first round, so they can't be in the same group for the second round. Maybe we could solve this problem by just swapping player 28 with a player that we already placed in a round 2 group. So let's try swapping 28 with, say, player 26. Unfortunately, this doesn't work because we placed player 28 into a group with player 11, who they already faced in round 1. Okay, since that didn't work, let's just undo that swap between players 28 and 26, and then highlight that we can't swap with anyone in player 11's group. Of course, player 28's first group also included player 3, so we can't swap into the group containing player 3 either. It's worth noting that even though player 28 already played player 11, if they swapped directly with player 11, then they wouldn't end up in the same group. So that does solve one problem, but it ends up just creating a different one. Player 11 is now part of the leftovers with player 25. Because players 11 and 25 were part of that same group in round 1, this swap also doesn't work, so we'll undo it and mark that we cannot swap with player 11 or with player 3 for identical reasons. More generally, we can't swap player 28 with somebody who has already played one of the other leftover players. We haven't discussed the other leftover players yet, that's players 15 and 23, but they become relevant now for that reason. We need to eliminate their round 1 opponents as possibilities for swapping as well. After considering all of these restrictions, we see that there's 13 players that player 28 cannot swap with. That's a lot more restrictions than you might expect after just one complete round, but there's still plenty of options. So we'll just go ahead and swap 28 with player 10 here to finish the round 2 groups. Let's skip ahead a bit now to show where we can really run into issues. In this example, we've managed to find working schedules for rounds 3 and 4. We've also gotten most of the way through scheduling round 5 without issue, but we have 4 leftover players again. Let's look at what groups these leftover players were part of during the first 4 rounds. We can see that players 28 and 29 faced each other in round 2, so this collection of leftover players won't work as our final round 5 group. Let's see if we can swap 29 with an already placed player to fix this. First, we want to make sure that we aren't adding 29 to a group with somebody they've already played, so let's highlight their opponents from previous rounds. We see that every group in round 5 has at least one person that player 29 has already faced. This significantly limits the options player 29 can swap with. In fact, if we highlight all the players that share a group with one of player 29's former opponents in red, we see that there are only 3 options remaining, specifically players 4, 30, and 18. However, if we look back at those players' previous opponents, we have another problem. In round 1, player 30 played in a group with player 31, who is one of the leftover players. Also, in round 4, players 4 and 18 played in a group with another leftover player, that's player 10. So, if we swapped player 29 with any of these 3 players, it would just create a new conflict in the leftover players. As we can see, there's nobody player 29 can swap with. In fact, we're kind of stuck. Sure, maybe we could go back and make different decisions, but there's no guarantee that an earlier change wouldn't just run into a different issue eventually. So, what should we do? It was around this point while working on the problem that I realized I couldn't possibly be the first person to try to figure something like this out. So I decided to stop trying to solve this on my own and see if I could look up some more information. And that's when I found something called the social golfer problem. The social golfer problem imagines that you are responsible for creating a schedule for a number of golfers who are very social. They want to play with as many different people as possible. The formulation given on Wikipedia is 32 golfers play golf once a week in groups of 4. Schedule these golfers to play for as many weeks as possible without any 2 golfers playing together in a group more than once. This was amazing. I was trying to schedule 32 people in groups of 4 over multiple rounds with no repeated opponents, and it turned out that this exact problem had its own Wikipedia page and a known optimal solution. For the record, the optimal solution has 10 rounds without any repeated opponents, and this meant I could choose any 5 of these 10 rounds for the tournament and not have any repeats. This would work as long as the tournament had exactly 32 people. So, at this point, I had to start worrying about other possible player counts. So far, we've talked about finding schedules where each round has 8 groups of 4 players. And while that is the original version of the problem, nowadays the social golfer problem refers to a more general class of related problems. We can vary both the number of groups and the number of players within each group. So instead of talking about 8 groups of 4 players, you can instead ask about schedules for G groups of P players. In this video, when talking about a specific number of groups and players, I'll refer to it as the GP version of the problem. So, for example, the original version was the 8-4 social golfer problem because it consists of 8 groups of 4 players. You might hope that the 8-4 solution that we know is just one version of a more general solution that could be applied to any number of groups and players. Unfortunately, there were a few immediate signs that that wouldn't be the case. First, the Wikipedia page doesn't describe how the 10-round solution for the 8-4 problem was found. It just lists it. Second, the 8-4 problem was first asked in 1998 and wasn't solved until Alejandro Aguado published a solution in 2004. I don't know that the problem was worked on for that entire 6-year period, but it clearly wasn't trivial. Third, one of the top results if you search for the social golfer problem is goodenoughgolfers.com, which tries to give schedules that might have some repeated opponents, but are hopefully good enough for what you're trying to do. It says, quote, real solutions to these problems can be extremely slow, but approximations are fast and often good enough for real-world purposes. And finally, by far the most definitive collection of resources on the problem is by Marcus Triska. He not only wrote his master's thesis on the problem, but he also has a 72-minute video about the complexities of trying to find a solution programmatically. He has a ton of tips for using Scryer Prolog to help solve the problem, but even his video only finds a solution for 9 rounds and not the optimal 10. I'll link to all of these resources in the description if anybody's interested in learning more about the general problem, but the larger lesson I took from all of this is that I shouldn't try to solve the general problem. I should look for some solutions that work for our purposes and accept that it might be a bit messy and will involve some trade-offs. With this in mind, I want us to look at a problem inspired by another sport, fencing. This problem will be a little bit different and will have more restrictions than the social golfer problem, but these extra restrictions will also provide more structure, which will help us when trying to schedule our tournament. In team fencing matches, both teams have 3 fencers. During the match, every fencer from one team will face each of their opponents from the other team in a one-on-one bout. So, how can we schedule these bouts? Let's represent these 2 teams as 3 yellow and blue circles. And we'll say that each column represents one bout. So, for example, we'll track one of the fencers from the yellow team, and in this first round, they face the blue fencer who is in the same column as them. Okay, each fencer has now faced one opponent. However, now they need to face somebody else in the next round. We'll go ahead and slide the blue team one spot to the left so that nobody is facing the same opponent again. We'll also loop this leftmost blue fencer to the end of the row so that they can continue to create pairs for everyone. All right, now each fencer on the yellow team is facing a new member of the blue team. We'll go ahead and track that this new blue fencer has faced the yellow team member we've already been tracking. And we'll do this for one more round, and we see that our yellow dot has now played all of the blue team members. This was admittedly a simple example, but we can make it a little bit more complicated. First, I want to point out that it really doesn't matter how many people are on each team. For example, we can put 7 people on each team and it still works. As you can see, the yellow fencers just keep playing the next blue fencer in line. So whether there's 3 people or 100 people on each team, a yellow fencer will eventually play all of the blue fencers before getting any repeats. Okay, if the number of players on each team doesn't matter, what happens if we change the number of teams? This time we'll add in a 3rd red team. Obviously, we're no longer in a fencing match at this point, but some other event with 3 players at a time. Each bout will have a yellow, blue, and red player now. So in the first round, we have our special yellow player faces these blue and red players. We now shift the teams for the next round, and we have a problem. Because we shifted the blue and red teams by the same amount, we see that the blue and red players that we marked in round 1 are scheduled to play each other again. Okay, it's not a huge problem. We'll just shift the red team by another spot. And we'll do this each round. That is, we'll shift the blue team by 1 spot and the red team by 2 spots, so they don't have pairs playing each other in back-to-back rounds. And as before, if any of these players move past the first yellow player, we'll just move them to the back of the line. All right, let's continue through the rounds now. And hey, it worked. But it's a little bit less obvious why it worked this time. Previously, we knew that our yellow player would face all the blue players because the blue line moved over 1 each round. So the yellow player just always faced the next blue player each round. However, the red line is moving over by 2 each round. So the yellow player faces every other red player. Does this always work? Let's try it again with 6 people on each team instead of 7. And now we have a problem. Our yellow player is scheduled to play a red player that they've already played against. So why do we have this problem with 6 players but not with 7? Well, the short answer is because we're shifting the red team by 2, and 6 is a multiple of 2. If we add some lines after every 2 players and only show the yellow and red teams, this can help highlight the issue. Because we're shifting by 2, the red team is essentially made up of 3 pairs of players. Each time we shift by 2, we're moving each pair into the next pair's spot. Importantly, the player on the left side of each pair always stays on the left side of the pair, and the yellow player can never face these left side players. Also, this isn't just the case with a shift of 2. We can try shifting red by 4 instead, but that's just shifting over by 2 pairs at a time, so the left players will stay on the left again. And it also doesn't just have to be pairs. If we instead break the red team into groups of 3, we can create a similar issue. By shifting by 3, we ensure that the yellow player only faces the leftmost red player in each group of 3. So we can see what causes repeats. When the number of columns is a multiple of a number and a team shifts by a multiple of that same number, the teams get locked into a pattern where only certain players face certain opponents. To drive this pattern home, let's increase the number of players and teams. We now have 10 players per team and 10 teams. Each row will shift by 1 more than the previous row, and to make that easier to track, I'll note on the right side how much each team will shift each round. Keeping in mind that 10 equals 2 times 5, watch what happens when we run through the rounds. All the teams that have shifted by a multiple of 2 have the same pattern, where every second player is filled in. Similarly, the team that shifted by 5 each round has every 5th player filled in. These patterns come from the fact that 10 can be divided evenly by 2 and 5. In general, you will get repeated opponents if the amount a team shifts each round shares a factor with the number of players on each team. And conversely, if they don't share a factor, you won't get repeated opponents. We can see this by looking at the rounds that don't skip any players. Those are the rows that shifted by 1, 3, 7, or 9 each round. It's not a coincidence that those are the numbers that are not multiples of 2 or 5, which are the factors of 10. One consequence of this is that if we want to have many teams without repeated opponents, we need to consider the factors of the number of players on each team. The easiest way to address this is just to use a prime number. For example, 7 is prime, so it won't share factors with smaller numbers. We can run through an example with many teams and get no repeated opponents.
So far, we've been focusing on whether players from the yellow team face every member of the other teams, but this logic works for the other teams as well. For example, instead of focusing on a yellow player, we can instead focus on one of the red players. We'll note that the red team shifts by 2 compared to the yellow team, by 1 compared with the blue team, and so forth. Because none of these numbers share a factor with 7, we shouldn't get any repeated opponents. So to start, we'll highlight the red player's opponents, and even after the red player moves for a round, we will continue to highlight their new opponents in their new position. As we continue through the rounds, we see that the red player faces every opponent from every other team, as expected. And this works for any player you might want to highlight on any team. At this point, I think it's time to tie this all back to our tournament structure. This process shows that we could create some sort of event with 7 teams and matches with 7 players each. However, in order to be a Mario Kart 64 tournament, we need to reduce this to 4 players per match. Fortunately, there's an easy fix. We can just use 4 of the 7 teams. Additionally, the example we just worked through allows us to play up to 7 rounds without any repeated opponents. Now, we just wanted to do 5 rounds for the tournament prelims, so we can just choose any 5 of those 7 rounds and have a workable schedule. 4 teams with 7 people each would be a total of 28 people. As we approach tournament day, this looked like the number of players we would have for the event. So we could use this format for scheduling. I should make clear that for our purposes, these teams aren't really teams. They aren't actually competing against each other, and there's no team winner. It's just a useful analogy for how the scheduling works, but everybody's results are based on their own individual matches. With that out of the way, the question now was, if we're going to use this team-based format, how do we select teams? And before we could answer that, we had to ask, how do the teams affect the tournament structure? And surprisingly, the answer to that latter question is they really don't, or at least they don't have to. Let me explain. Let's imagine you're playing in the tournament and you don't know anything except that during the prelims you'll play 5 mini matches with no repeated opponents. If you do some quick counting, you'll see that you're going to play 15 different opponents during the prelims. If you also know that your opponents are selected without any pattern, it's clear that you're equally likely to face any particular opponent. Now, imagine that you're also told that this tournament will be using this team-based structure. However, who is on each team and the order that everybody's placed within their respective teams are still both random. While the existence of teams feels meaningful, what does it actually tell you? You're still going to face 15 different opponents, and you're still equally likely to play against each person in the tournament because everything was chosen at random. So really, it changes nothing about who you're likely to face. At this point, you might be wondering, if the team structure doesn't change anything, why are we bothering with it? And that's a good question. First, let's just remember that finding any working schedule when dealing with the social golfer problem can be difficult. While the 8.4 version of this problem, which schedules 32 people, has a published solution on Wikipedia, the 7.4 version, designed for 28 people, does not. So just having any working schedule is huge. The second aspect is that we can actually take advantage of this team structure to address one potential issue. Basically, if opponents are chosen randomly, somebody could end up facing particularly strong or weak opponents. But the team-based structure provides a way to reduce the likelihood that this will happen and reduce the impact when it does. The key insight is that players can never play somebody who is on the same team as them. So, if somebody is on a team with all the best players,
they won't have to compete against any of them. But if none of the strong players are on somebody's team, that person might end up playing all the strong players. So the fairest thing to do is to distribute the strongest players evenly across the teams so that everybody will play some, but not all, of the strongest players. Now, to determine who the best players were, we didn't have a ton of data to work with, but we did have results from 2024, the previous year. Fortunately, everybody who made the semifinals in 2024 was returning for 2025. So we had 4 returning finalists and 4 players that had lost in the semifinals in the previous year. By evenly dividing these players across the 4 teams, we could ensure each team would have 1 previous finalist, 1 previous semifinalist, and 5 other players. This guaranteed that each person would be on a team with a finalist and a semifinalist, and therefore would not play those people during the prelims. Now, because we were only playing 5 rounds in the prelims, each person would only play 5 of the 7 people on each team other than their own. So the finalists and semifinalists wouldn't play every person on the other teams, and there was still some luck of the draw. In other words, this didn't totally eliminate the role of luck, but it did reduce it. We can see this by looking at a table of how many finalists a player is likely to face when we have random teams versus these balanced teams. And I'd really like to draw attention to the bottom row, which shows the probability that a player will face all of the previous year's finalists. Balancing teams reduces this probability from 7.8%, or about 1 in 13, to 0. So this change probably did prevent a couple people from getting really terribly unlucky draws. Now, we've created a tournament structure that works for 28 people, and we previously saw one that works for 32 people. However, when we finalized our player count for the tournament, we actually had 29 people. This was a little awkward because 29 is not a multiple of 4. This meant we couldn't just stick to 4-player versus matches and would need to include some 3-player ones as well. This wasn't ideal, particularly since most players like 3-player matches less than 4-player matches, but we had to make do. So I needed to figure out how to make a 29-person schedule. The first potential solution I came up with was easy, but a little bit rough. The idea was just to start with our 32-person schedule and eliminate 3 of the players. For example, you could eliminate players 22, 28, and 32 here. The only tricky aspect is that you would have to make sure that the 3 players you choose to eliminate weren't scheduled to play each other, because you don't want to eliminate multiple players from the same match. As long as you do that, though, you're left with a 29-person schedule where 3 matches in each round have 3 players instead of 4. This works, but you end up with a total of 15 3-person matches, which is more than we wanted. Also, you don't get the benefits of our team-based solution. So I kept looking for a better method, and I eventually found the answer while eating a cheeseburger in a Wendy's parking lot. That part isn't really relevant, I just think it's funny. Anyway, the idea for this better method is to start with the 28-person schedule. And while we generated this schedule using the moving dots method, it's easier to work with if we just show the results in tables. Instead of naming the players just with numbers, I've used a letter and a number to show which team they are on. So player B3 is just the 3rd player on team B. As mentioned before, this team-based method generates 7 rounds of matches, but we only need 5 for the prelims, so we can get rid of 2 of the rounds. This leaves us with a 5-round schedule for 28 people. We want a schedule with 29 people, so we have to make some changes to make room for the extra person. To start, I'm going to bring back one match from one of the rounds I deleted. The 4 players in this match are now scheduled to play one extra match. For each of these 4 players, I choose one of their other matches and delete that player. So those 4 players are now back to the correct number of matches. But there are now 4 open spots in the schedule where we can add the extra 29th player. This means the extra player is now scheduled to play 4 matches. That's still 1 short of what we need, so I'll create an additional match just for them. And they'll need opponents for this match, but I can just choose any 2 players that they have not yet faced to join them. And just like that, all 29 players are now scheduled to play 5 matches, and we have a working schedule. There are a few complications to watch out for during this process. Because we're not following the team format for the extra player, we need to be careful to make sure that they have no repeated opponents. Also, the extra player has no guarantees about how many finalists or semifinalists they will face. And because we added 2 matches and shifted players around, figuring out exactly when matches should be played becomes slightly more complicated. You can solve all of these issues without much difficulty, though. There's a lot of positives to this approach, too. In addition to all the benefits we get from the team-based approach, it also reduces the number of 3-player matches from 15 to 3. And with more people playing in an average match, it reduces the total number of prelim matches from 40 to 37 as well. And that saves us a little bit of time. While there are certainly things to quibble with in regards to the prelim schedule, I hope I've conveyed that this whole process was always going to have trade-offs. Ultimately, we got to a point where everybody was playing 5 matches. Nobody played the same player twice. We took steps to make the opponents a bit more even, and the players didn't have to worry about any of this. We just generated the groups and told everybody who they were playing, and it all ran pretty smoothly. Now that we've covered which players are in which groups, it's time to address how the scoring system worked. Mario Kart 64 doesn't have a built-in scoring system for versus mode, but the community has decided on a pretty simple method. You get 3 points for first place, 2 for second, 1 for third, and none for fourth. This works well for the 4-player matches, but I needed to decide how to handle scoring for 3-player matches as well. I decided that it needed to follow these rules. First, a player who wins all their races should have a perfect score, so they should also score 3 points per win. Conversely, a player who loses all their races should have the worst possible score, so they get 0 points. Finally, an average player should score the same amount in both 3-player and 4-player matches, and that means that second place in a 3-person match ends up getting 1.5 points. Each player's final prelim score is just the total number of points they earn during their 5 mini-matches, which consist of 20 total races. So scores can range anywhere from 0 to 60 points. If 2 players tie on points, the tiebreaker gives the advantage to the player who faced harder opponents. Essentially, if you and I tied, but your opponents scored more points during the prelims than my opponents did, we'd assume that you face the harder opponents. So you'd get the better ranking in that case. And these rankings determine the seeds for the knockout rounds. Now that we've finished discussing the prelims, it's time to cover the knockouts. Earlier, I pointed out that there are many different types of potential knockout brackets. We ended up deciding to go with a simple layout with minimum buys. This is really the most common type of bracket for knockout tournaments, and it's standard for a reason. It's easy and it works well. As a reminder, the knockout matches would be played over all 16 courses, and the 2 players who earned the most points would advance in the tournament, while the bottom 2 players would be eliminated. Because half of the players are eliminated in any match, that means one round of a standard knockout bracket eliminates half of all of the remaining players. This makes these tournaments work best when the number of players is a power of 2, because the field can be repeatedly cut in half. For example, the FIFA World Cup knockout bracket has historically had 16 teams, or 2 to the 4th, and is planning an increase to 32 teams, which is 2 to the 5th. And Wimbledon has a whopping 128 players, which is a convenient 2 to the 7th. Now, the number of players in our tournament was not a power of 2. The standard way to handle this situation is to award some buys so that the first round will reduce the field to a power of 2. We had 29 people participating in the group stage, but unfortunately, one of them had to withdraw before the knockout rounds, so that left 28 people. And we wanted to start by reducing that number to 16, which would mean eliminating 12 players. Because each match eliminates 2 players, that means we'd need to play 6 matches to accomplish this. Any players not in those 6 matches would receive a bye to the second round. You can see how this works in this animation. The first round has 6 matches of 4 players each. This leaves 4 players to receive buys. When we eliminate 2 players per match in the first round, we have 16 remaining players to play in the quarterfinals. This is then reduced to 8 players for the semifinals and then 4 players for the finals. Now that we have an actual tournament structure, what remains is to decide who gets the buys and who plays in which groups. We have 4 players per match, which makes things slightly more complicated, so I'll start with introducing some concepts from tournaments with 2 players per match. Let's imagine we have an 8-person tournament and the players are seeded. 1 for the best player, 2 for the second best, and so forth. We have to pair off the players to create the 4 matches for this round. How should we do this? Well, the first option is to ignore the seeding and do it randomly. The major risk here is that the number 1 seed might end up paired against the number 2 seed. These are 2 players who are both good enough that you'd expect them to make the finals. Why would you want to risk forcing one of them out early? It feels bad for those players, and viewers generally want to see the top players battle it out in the finals as well. So we want it to be the case that if the top 2 players keep winning, they will meet in the finals. And based on the same idea, the top 4 players should meet in the semifinals. That means we don't want to pair up 2 of the top 4 players right now, because that would force at least one of them out of the tournament. If they can't face each other, each of the top 4 players will have to play one of the bottom 4 players. At this point, you could decide to randomly pair the top 4 players with the bottom 4 players. This technique is usually described as drawing from pots. That is, you put the top half's players' names in one pot and the bottom half's players' names in another one, and then you draw one name from each pot, and that's a pairing. This randomness in the pairing process is seen as a positive in some sports, such as tennis. In tennis, the rankings are very stable, and a player's seed is likely to be the same for many tournaments in a row. if you don't introduce some randomness into the process, you will end up with the same pairings for every tournament, which is kind of boring. However, there are some downsides. In our example, if you're the 4 seed, you could end up facing the 8 seed in the first round and have the easiest opponent. Meanwhile, the 5 seed could be facing the 1 seed and have the hardest opponent. Despite the fact that the 4 seed and the 5 seed are very close to each other in ranking, they are having very different experiences just because of luck. So most tournaments choose to eliminate this randomness and pair players based on their seeds. Specifically, they use a method called fold pairing. It's called this because it looks like you lined up the list of players and then folded it in half. Thus, the top player faces the bottom player, the second best player faces the second worst player, and so forth. Because better seeded opponents always face worse seeded opponents, this also has the benefit of encouraging players to try their best to improve their seeding. However, there is a downside, and that might become clear when I tell you that while this process is formally known as fold pairing, it is more commonly referred to as slaughter pairing. This is because if you have your best players face your worst players, you tend to get very non-competitive matches. For example, in the March Madness bracket for college basketball, there are 4 regions that each have 16 teams. In each region, the 1 seed plays the 16 seed in the first round, so there are 4 of these games per year. In the 41 years this format has been used, there have been 164 of these games. The number 1 seeds have won 162 of these 164 games. But shout out to the 2018 UMBC team. They were not only the first 16 seed to defeat a 1 seed, it was a blowout. They beat Virginia by 20 points, 74-54. People lost their minds. However, the reality is that that's not typical. 98% of the time, the 1 seed wins, and the vast majority of those games aren't even close. While these lopsided matches usually aren't exciting, the truth is that nobody wants to play the best team in the tournament in the first round, and everybody wants to play the worst team. At least if you base it on seeding, it's fair in that way. Slaughter pairings explain how you can create matchups for 1 round of a tournament. However, you need to be a little more careful when planning the entire tournament. Let's see what happens when we apply slaughter pairings to our 8-team example. 1 plays 8, 2 plays 7, and so on. However, with this bracket, we can still run into problems in the next round. If all the favorites win, we'll have 1 playing 2 and 3 playing 4, which does not fit with the slaughter pairing methodology. If we want to use this methodology throughout the tournament, we'll have to work backwards. If the favorites always win, we want the 1 and 2 seeds to make the finals. This means they need to play in separate semifinals, and we can match them with their expected opponents according to slaughter pairings. We can repeat the same process with all of the semifinalists to generate the quarterfinals. If you see a seeded 8-team knockout bracket in almost any sport, it is very likely it will use these matchups. Now that we've covered how pairings work in tournaments with 2-player matches, we can discuss how to create groups for tournaments with 4-player matches. Because we have twice as many players per match, let's double the number of players in our example to 16. As we think about creating groups, we might decide that it still makes sense for the number 1 top seed to face the number 16 bottom seed in the first round. However, we need to add 2 players to this match. We could add the 14 and 15 seeds. That would be the easiest possible matchup for the 1 seed. However, we have 2 players advancing per match, so this would guarantee that one of the 3 worst seeded players would advance to the semifinals, which doesn't seem right. We could try to balance the group by having the top 2 seeds play the bottom 2 seeds. This does seem more fair, but there's a few issues. First, we have the top 2 players playing each other in the first round. This isn't as bad as when only 2 players are in a match. Both the top players could still advance, so they could both make the finals. But it might take some of the excitement out of the finals match if everybody has already seen these players play each other. Also, it just seems a little off that the 2 seed doesn't get to be the top seed in their match. We'll have 4 matches in the first round, so shouldn't the top 4 players get to be the favorites in their respective matches? The most common approach to addressing these issues is to use a modified version of fold pairing. In the 4-player case, it might be better to call it fold grouping, since it makes groups, not pairs. I'm not actually sure if this method has a specific name, but I like to call it accordion grouping, because it looks like this. Here we still have the 1 seed playing the 16 seed, but they are now joined by the 8 and 9 seeds. This is also nice from a viewer standpoint, because even if the 1 seed blows out the 16 seed, there will probably be a competitive battle for second between the 8 and 9 seeds. If you want to maintain accordion grouping each round, you can create this bracket. And if you get the expected players advancing from each match, you do get the top seeded players in the finals. However, there is an aspect that I don't like about this format. Specifically, if 2 players advance from the same match, they end up playing each other again in the next round. So I prefer to swap some players like this. This slightly changes the seeding matchups, but not by much. For example, in the first quarterfinal, the 8 and 9 seeds were swapped with the 7 and 10 seeds. So one went up a seed, one went down a seed. If this has an effect, it's pretty small and it comes with a lot of benefits. First, it makes the tournament more social. Players end up playing more unique opponents, and viewers get to see that variety in matches as well. I think that would make the change worthwhile by itself, but there's also another huge benefit that we get by sending winners and runners-up to different matches in the following round. Notice that in the highlighted semifinal, players 1 and 4 were expected to win their quarterfinal matches, while players 8 and 5 were expected to get second. We can make this distribution explicit by stating that the winners of the first 2 quarterfinals and the runners-up of the other 2 quarterfinals will play in the highlighted semifinal match. If there are no upsets, we'll have the expected results in each match and still have these groupings. But if, say, the 6 seed upset the 4 seed in the quarterfinals, the 6 seed and 4 seed would swap positions in the semis, because the 6 seed won instead of being the runner-up. The semifinal match still contains 2 winners and runners-up from the quarterfinals. It's just that the 6 seed is now one of those winners and is rewarded by only having to play one other winner in the semifinals. This means that there's actually stakes for who gets first and second in a match instead of both players moving on to the same match in the next round. But while planning this tournament, this is all hypothetical. We don't know who will win each match and can only set up the initial groupings and paths through the tournament. And this is a solid bracket for a 16-person tournament. However, to bring this back to PA Kart Meet, we had 28 people, and that meant we needed an earlier round. Fortunately, at this point, the problem is fairly simple. We know 4 people need buys, and it makes sense for those to be the top 4 seeds. Meanwhile, we can create the other groups with the accordion grouping method in mind. Similar to before, we can just specify that the winner and runner-up of each first round match will advance to a specific quarterfinal match. And that's it. That's how you create a tournament structure for Mario Kart 64. Well, this ended up being a long video, and I didn't even cover all the ideas we didn't end up using for the tournament. The logistics of gathering and tabulating results, or all the things that Brody handled, like venue selection and food. If you're wondering how the tournament turned out, though, it was pretty amazing. We had a total of 360 tournament races, and that even involved a few tiebreaker races in the knockout stage. There were a few logistical hiccups, including the stream dying halfway through the finals, but we built in enough time to the schedule so that we could figure it all out. If you're interested in running your own tournament for any game, I leave you with two somewhat contradictory messages. First, be prepared. Time is an obvious restriction on tournaments, and you should have at least a rough idea of how many people are going to show up. You should know what you'll be doing when and how to adjust to the likely scenarios. You have time to plan before the tournament, so use it. And second, just go for it. Sure, you need to understand your players, understand your constraints, and then make the trade-offs you need to make. A decent plan, executed well, is way more valuable than the perfect plan that never sees the light of day. Anyways, PA Kart Meet 2025 was a busy and somewhat stressful weekend, but I heard so many people talk about what a great time they had, the friends they got to see, new friends that they made, and just how wonderful the whole community is that surrounds the game. At the end of the meet, when we had everything wrapped up, and Brody and I were standing in an empty building, we just kind of turned to each other and said, "We did it. We actually pulled this off." It was a pretty amazing moment. And we plan to be back next year. If you're interested in joining the Mario Kart 64 community, I've dropped a link to the website and Discord in the description. We pride ourselves on welcoming players of all skill levels, and we are already making plans for PA Meet 2026. So, in the words of a pretty decent kart driver,
Hey, you very good. See you next time.